Okay, so yesterday we started talking about thermoregulation in mammals as one of the factors, the core temperature that is homeostatically controlled, and right, the different ways in which heat and energy is exchanged between the body and the environment. Now, right, mammals are endotherms. Endotherms, right? Which means that they use metabolism of their body, right? Their own metabolic processes to provide, right, heat, at least some of it, to maintain, right, their body temperature. And again, when we talk about body temperature, we're talking about the core body temperature, not the surface body temperature. And because mammals are able to regulate their body temperature, right, they can survive in a very wide range of environments. Okay. They can survive in a very wide range of environments, and they basically, because they're relying on metabolical processes, that means that, right, the more body temperature they require, I mean, sorry, not the more, but the more they need to regulate body temperature against the environment, which is basically talking about when you're living in colder, right, regions. Right, the higher the metabolic activity will be, and because the metabolic activity they're talking about refers to digestion and everything after that, right, we will need to consume more food. Right, and so that food will generate metabolic heat. Okay, now thermoregulation, right, in mammals is a homeostatic process. So how does that take place? And it goes both ways, right? So if, right, the body is warming up, you need to cool down, and that also depends on the environment that you're in. So if you're in a hot environment and that heat is warming your body, then you will need to cool down. If you're in a cold environment and that cold is cooling your body as well, then you need to warm up. So it goes both ways. So the major organ that is involved in thermoregulation is the skin. And the skin is the largest organ of the body. The whole skin covering the entire body is considered as one organ. So what benefit does it have, right? So for other mammals, as we mentioned yesterday, uh, they might lose water from their mouths or perhaps nose or somewhere, their eyes maybe, if that helps with cooling. But the skin, the benefit of the skin is it has the largest surface area, obviously, because that's all the surface area of the body, external surface area. Right? And so if there's cooling occurring via the skin, that would be the most effective. Right? So on a side, skin is waterproof, and so it is a protective barrier. Right? So it protects, it stops foreign particles, which may be, for example, dust and grime and maybe microorganisms from entering the body. Right? And obviously it protects from mechanical damage. And also from, the UV radiation of the sun. You've got about 2 meters squared. That's a lot of skin. That's the surface area of your skin. And it makes about 16% of your body weight. So that's heavy. Right? So if you're 50 kilos, so that's right 5 and 7.5 something kilos, just your skin. That's a lot. Now, coming to the actual point of interest, right? How does the skin help in keeping cool? We're going to talk about keeping cool, and then we're going to talk about warming up. Okay. So there's a rich supply of capillaries near the surface of the skin. Right? And cooling through the skin, through the blood flowing through the skin can occur via radiation, convection, and conduction. Through the skin. So what happens when you know the temperature rises, right? When the temperature rises, or in this case they're mentioning the external temperature is rising. Why are they mentioning the external temperature rising? because right, that external temperature will affect us. We will be gaining heat, and we don't want that, so we want to maintain our internal temperature. And so what would happen is a process called vasodilation. Right, vaso meaning vascular, meaning the blood vessels, dilation meaning widening. Right, so the vessels, the blood vessels, they widen, which increases blood flow. Right, and the vasodilation is brought about by the closing of something called the arteriovenous shunt. Right, so more blood is flowing through the capillaries near the surface of the skin, and that is why, right, sometimes the skin appears red when the external temperature is high, and that is because there is more blood flowing. And so, right, via the blood, as you mentioned, right, energy is being lost to the environment. By radiation. But that's not all, right? There are what are called erector pili muscles in your skin, and they're attached to the hair follicles. So, right, the hair, you know that they go into the skin. So, right, this is the surface of the skin, this is your hair, but the hair is going a bit deep inside, right? It's not on the surface. And you've got some muscles attached to it. So, erector pili muscles, they are relaxed. Right, and these guys are attached to the hair follicles. And what that does is that causes the hair to fall and lie close to the skin. And so when they're flat and lying close to the skin, they are not trapping air. Right? And air, as we mentioned, is an insulator. So there is no layer of insulation around the skin because of the hair. Right? And so, right, heat is not preserved, and because you want to cool, right, you don't want heat to be preserved, you want heat to be lost. Now, this entire mechanism is very useful in hairy mammals. For, bears and cats and dogs and etc. They're not as useful in humans because we don't have enough hair to actually have an effect. Unless someone's extra hairy, like really extra hairy, the quantity of hair on a person, this mechanism does take place, but it's not effective for humans at least. Right, and something similar happens with birds as well. You can see them all fluffed up when in the winter, and then their feathers are like smooth and flat against their body when it's hot, and so that's basically what's happening. So when it's hot, the feathers are flat against the body. Then another thing that's happening is that sweat production increases. Right, so when the core temperature goes up, even when the external temperature goes up, right? Again, why are we talking about the external temperature going up? Because it will affect us, right? We will gain that heat from the environment and heat up ourselves, and we want to prevent that, so we're going to keep cool. And so sweating increases. Right, so sweat is a liquid, it has water, it has salts. Right, it is primarily water, but it has salts and other substances as well. And so what happens is that it covers the skin and then it evaporates using the heat of the body heat, or maybe the external heat. In either case, when it evaporates, it cools the body because it's utilizing the heat that you want to lose. And so, right, we normally produce about 1 decimeter, normally 1 decimeter cube, which is basically 1 liter of sweat per day. Right, so that is another way water is lost. And on very hot days or very high in conditions where we've worked out a lot, whether we're exercising or any other physical activity, right, we can go up till 12 decimeter cube of sweat being produced. And obviously in those cases you need to drink a lot of water. Then there comes subcutaneous fat. Right, so that acts as an insulating layer. And so people who are very physically active, they have very little of that fat, right? And so they don't have a lot of insulation, and so they readily lose heat. But people who are overweight and they have stores of fat in their body, then they start feeling hot very fast, right? Especially when they engage in any sort of physical activity, because this actually it's insulating, so it's not allowing or preventing heat loss. Any questions?
No, sir.
Then we talk about keeping warm. So it's cold and you don't want to lose heat. And so what happens is pretty much the opposite. Right? So the arterio venous shunt, right, it opens and vasoconstriction occurs, so there's less blood flow to the skin, and so less heat is lost. Right, then you've got the erector pili muscles contracting, right, and that causes the hair to stand. And in mammals, what that basically would help to do is trap an insulating layer of air in hair, right, or fur or feathers, whatever you have. Again, right, in humans, this is not as effective, right? This is the part that's not really effective, right? Because if the electropalate muscles are relaxed and the hair is flat against the skin, then sure, right, heat's being lost. But air is not sufficiently trapped when this happens, and you get the signature goosebumps, right? So that sensation of those bumps on your skin, that's when the electropalate muscles are contracted. Okay, you're sweating less. And so cooling by evaporation is reduced, right? Yeah, and animals that have stores of fat, that helps. The stores of fat in humans don't really help because the type of fat is different. So it's not like a person who's fat would feel markedly less cold in when it does get cold, right? The subcutaneous fat in humans is not as effective, but in mammals, right? So you would see mammals storing fat for winters, right? In fact, some mammals go into hibernation, right? So the fat not only helps them because they're not hibernating out in the open, right? So obviously they're hibernating someplace that's insulated, right, under the ground or in a cave or in a nest or that's warm and insulated and everything. But right, they have these fat reserves which not only help with the insulation but they also help provide energy through their hibernation period. So that's also something. Right. Uh, Also, as I mentioned earlier, right, to keep warm, the metabolic rate of the body increases. You already mentioned that, right? So if you go to a cold region, you would maybe feel more hungry than you usually do, right? And that's because your body needs you to eat so that it digests that food and then uses the metabolic heat and from release directly from digestion and then later on via respiration to maintain your core body temperature. Right, there's another thing that happens to keep warm is shivering, right? And so that is the rapid contraction of muscles. And obviously, as I mentioned, right, thick, well, I already mentioned that, a thick layer of subcutaneous fat, certain mammals. Now, there is this summarized table and illustrated as well. So I'll just show that to you. We're almost done with this. I think I have some time to actually introduce the next chapter. Right, so you've got this warm environment and cold environment. Right, you got this whole thing. And right, explanation of what's going on. There's another I believe, yeah. Right. So this shunt, right, over here, the shunt is just this little piece over here in between, right? So normally, blood is being diverted, so it's going up, but it's also flowing from down here, and so, right, the blood volume is being split. So when you want to lose heat, this closes, and so the majority of the blood volume is being passed up, right, and that is vasodilation. When you want to keep cool and you don't want to lose heat, this opens up, and so there's less blood flowing here because the volume of blood flowing is distributed, and because it's a more direct route, you probably have more blood flowing through the shunt, right? And so that's vasoconstriction, right? And so don't get confused by, oh, well, the vessels over here. Well, yeah, these are the ones, like this one's getting fat. This is the shunt. This basically represents, the thickness represents more blood flow, right? You can see that these vessels over here are drawn thinner, and that represents the vasoconstriction in the cold environment, right? And all the points over here. There's another flow chart over here, which also includes how the body actually detects a change in blood in body temperature. So let me just explain that on the whiteboard. And not surprisingly, the body temperature is controlled by monitoring the temperature of the blood. Right. So there are receptors in the brain. Right, there are two types of receptors that are involved. In thermoregulation. And so the first one is in the brain. Right, and these monitor the temperature of the blood. Right, the receptors in the skin monitor the external temperature. And so both of these combined allow for greater sensitivity and greater tuning of the body temperature. So the combined regulation, you've got greater sensitivity to temperature changes, and the temperatures, right, maintained within 1 degree centigrade. And so we know that the human body temperature is like 36.4 to 37.6 degrees centigrade. Right, that is the range of normal human body temperature, if I'm not mistaken. And so, right, about 1 degree or 1.2 degrees, and so, right, it is maintained within that range. If it goes lower, that means you're hypothermic, you've lost heat. And if it's going higher, then that means you've got a fever, right? And which probably means that you have some sort of infection. It's an immune response. Okay. And these guys, the ones in the brain, are in the hypothalamus, so the part of the brain that we are familiar with. So blood flowing through the hypothalamus is detected, and then, right, So, right, if the temperature of blood goes up, it increases, right? The thermoregulatory center, that's a term you need to know, is activated where? In the hypothalamus. Right? And it sends out impulses along autonomic motor nerves. Autonomic motor nerves. What are these guys? These are the guys that control involuntary processes. Right? So obviously thermoregulation is not something that is in your voluntary control. And that brings about the increase in sweating and the relaxation of the erector pili muscles, and if you were shivering earlier, you stop, the metabolic rate will reduce, all of those to keep you cool, right? And if the temperature of the blood falls, right, and so again, right, the thermoregulatory center sends signals for keeping the body warm. And that's it. Any questions?
No, sir.
You want to continue on to the next chapter?
Sure.
Okay. So we are moving on to chapter 8, which is the next chapter in the book as well. And we will be doing 8. We'll be starting with 8A1, which is the structure of neurons. So, right, in fact, right, chapter 8 in its entirety, because I think we'll be doing the whole thing, is coordination. And well, I think we'll be skipping the last part. So, right now we are doing coordination and response. And so 8A1, structure of neurons. Right, so we're starting with basic structure of the nervous system. Right, so to control bodily functions, bodily processes, are controlled by the hormonal system, which we've talked about, and the nervous system, which we will talk about. Right, so the nervous system is made up of millions of neurons, right, or nerve cells. And these guys are specialized for transmitting electric impulses or signals, right, throughout the body of the organism. Right, so the basic pathway is you've got receptor cells somewhere in the body, right? They pick up a stimulus. That stimulus is transferred to a sensory neuron, so that's one kind of neuron. We'll talk about that, right? And that, you know, goes to the nervous system, and from there it's passed on to motor neurons, and from there it goes to effectors, right, which bring about a response. What are effectors? Receptors. So receptors, for example, the guys that are receiving the stimulus are receiving, right? They could. So let's see. Receptors, right, can be external. So we just talked about thermoregulation. So right, maybe receptors in the skin. Or internal. So the thermoregulatory center in the hypothalamus, right, has receptors to detect changes in blood temperature, and so, right, that, and then effectors are some muscle or gland, right, that brings about a change, a response. So in case of thermoregulation, right, the effector is the skin, right, the muscles in the skin and the vessels in the skin and all of that. Right, larger, more complex animals, right, their nervous system is split into two parts, right, two types or two subdivisions of division of labor. One is the central nervous system, which includes the brain and the spinal cord. And then you've got the peripheral nervous system, right, which is everything else that is not in the CNS, right? So this is also called the CNS, this is also called the PNS. So let's just write everything other, right? So all the nerves and everything. And right, more complex mammals also have specialized sensory organs or sense organs, right? And these contain right, group of receptors. So examples are obviously talk about the skin, we have the eye, right? We have the ear, and so we can pick up different sensations from these and right complex stimuli and then process these. Okay, anything else in the introductory matter? Yeah. So, right, I think I already mentioned here, but just to highlight that, sensory neurons carry impulses from receptors to, in most cases, the central nervous system, and motor neurons carry impulses, right, from the central nervous system to effector organs. Next up is the structure and function of neurons, which I believe, right, because it does have a bit of detail, so I will leave that for the next time. Oh, and I think one more thing before, so yeah, in fact, yeah, I missed a point. So let's move that. Nerves, right? Nerves, keep in mind, nerves are not the same as neurons. They're not the same thing. So neurons are individual cells of the nervous system, whereas nerves are bundles of nerve fibers. Right? What are nerve fibers? Right? Nerve fibers are extensions of neurons that carry impulses. And when we talk about the structure of neurons, right, we'll go into detail. So there are certain nerves that have only sensory neurons, so lots of them, and those are called sensory nerves. Then there's some that have only motor neurons, and those are called motor nerves. And right, some that have mix or both, and those are called mixed nerves. All right.
Yes, sir.
Any questions?
No.
Okay. So, right, we'll pick up the next time. We'll talk about the structure of neurons, structure and function of neurons, how they work, right? And then we'll continue on to talking about how impulses travel. All right.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I'll see you next time then, inshallah.
Sure, sir.